Lalita Shri Vishakanvitamscha Ridvapre Navabhakti Shasya Vitati Sanjivani Swagama Rambe Kamata Partudaha Damani Vishwapogolasini Duran me Marushaki Nopi Sarasi Bhavaya Bhuyat Prabhu Shri Chaitanya Kripa Nirankusha Madhurya Kadambini Bhakti Purva Srita Tang Turasam Pashya Dattadhi Tam Nomi Satatam Rupa Nama Priyajanam Harihi Hari Om Tat Sat. Okay. So today we'll be covering the Chaturthi Amrita Vrishti, the fourth shower of nectar, which Sri Vishwanath Chakravarti Thakur has entitled Nishanda Bandhura, which means the flow of ambrosia. And the subject matter of this chapter is Naishtiki Bhakti or Nishta Bhakti. So I guess it's at the stage of Nishta that the flow of devotional service can really be experienced on a visceral level. It's instead of the likely experience of many of us, where there's, you can say, hills and valleys experience, peaks and troughs. Is that how you say that? Troughs? I always say that word wrong. I think that's the word. Trough is like the low point in the valley. Peaks and troughs. Anyway, I don't know if I'm saying that word correctly. So this experience of peaks and valleys, hills, is due to anarthas. So there isn't a flow of devotional service, sometimes very potent, sometimes not very potent, in terms of our practice and experience of it. So at the stage of Nishta, there's a continuous flow of powerful bhakti practices. So he's entitled it The Flow of Ambrosia, the Flow of Nectar. What we're gonna cover here first. So the way he opens up this chapter is a justification for the sequence of the discussion. So earlier he had mentioned in the beginning of the chapter on Bhajanam Kriya, so this would have been the second shower. The second shower. He describes there that there are two types of Bhajan Kriya, right? Anishchita Bhajan Kriya and Nishchita Bhajan Kriya. So then he goes on to describe 6 types of Anishchita Bhajan Kriya. And after describing the 6 types of Anishchita Bhajan Kriya, he went into a discussion on the nullification of anarthas. And then afterwards, in this shower, he's describing Nishchita Bhajan Kriya. So he brings up a doubt that someone may have that your presentation is out of sequence, because first you mentioned Anishchita Bhajan Kriya, then you described the 6 types, and then you went into this whole discussion of Anartha Nivritti, and now only you're describing Nishchita Bhajan Kriya. So the first part of his exposition in this shower is to describe why he developed his presentation in this particular way. So the reason for it, he references verses at the beginning of the Srimad Bhagavatam. So we're going to look at these verses because they're quite important verses of the Srimad Bhagavatam, describing how bhakti blossoms from the stage of sadhana to sadhya. Very important verses. As you know, the first chapter of Srimad Bhagavatam, there are 6 questions, all of which pertain to Krishna. The first 2 questions of which pertain to what is the ultimate prayojan and what is the means to its attainment. Those are the first 2 questions of the sages Ainamisharanya. So in chapter 2, when Sutta Goswami is answering those 2 questions, he answers it really in one verse, the famous verse you all must be knowing. Savai pungsa paro dharma yato bhaktira dokshuje ahetukiya pratiyataya yatma suprasidati. So that supreme dharma by which the prayojana can be actualized is called as the paradharma. So he says the supreme dharma is that by which bhakti to adokshaja can be manifest or actualized. So savai pungsa, so for all humans, not just one or two. I mean, because bhakti can be practiced by humans largely, not by animals. So the supreme dharma, paradharma for all humans, is that dharma by which bhakti, and the word bhakti here in this verse means prema, can be actualized. So the only dharma that can lead to the manifestation of prema is itself also bhakti and a form known as sadhana. So basically, he says the paradharma is sadhana bhakti, and the supreme realization of performing that bhakti is also bhakti in the form of prema. And then the verses go on to describe the nature of prema bhakti. And then after this, Sutta Goswami goes into a discussion on why this is the paradharma and why this is the supreme prayojana. And then after doing so, he spends 5 verses, I think, 5, 6, 7, 18, 19, 20, 6 verses describing how bhakti enters into a person's life, how it blossoms, and how it leads to the sadhya or the prayojana. So these verses are very famous, and we're just going to look at them somewhat briefly here. And the reason we're doing so is because these are the verses that Sri Vishwanath is making reference to in the beginning of this discussion on Nishta, as an explanation for why he unpacked the sequence of discussion the way that he did. So let's look at these verses. We're not going to spend tons of time on them, but they're very important verses. And devotees should know. Practically, we all should know the entirety of chapter 2 is such an important chapter of the Srimad Bhagavatam. But these verses especially very much relate to the subject matter of the Madhurya Kadambini, which is a discussion on how bhakti develops from in different stages. So this is the first of the verses. Shushu sho shraddhanasya vasudeva kataruchihi. Syamaha sevaya vipra punya tirtha nishevana. So, O twice-born sages, by serving those devotees who are completely freed from all vice, great service is done. By such service, one gains affinity for hearing the message of Vasudeva. So here the word uses Mahat Sevaya. So the first stage in bhakti, as we've already heard also, is indicated by this phrase Mahat Sevaya, which means service to the great souls. And such service to the great souls is made possible by their mercy. So the first stage of bhakti, Sri Vishwanath will say in a concluding verse of his own composition, the first stage is Satam Kripa. You get the mercy of sadhus. And then by that mercy of sadhus, you have opportunity to render service. So Mahat Seva is indicating these 2 stages. First, mercy of sadhus, and then the opportunity to render service to them. From that service, then he says, Shraddha Dhanasya, then you get Shraddha, right? Srila Rupa Goswami is also saying this thing, Adhau Shraddha. So Adhau in the beginning, there's Mahat Seva, and then there's Shraddha. So you get Shraddha and Krishna Bhakti. After this Shraddha, he says here, Punya Tirtha Nishevana means one takes shelter of a pure guru. Because the word Tirtha, which we generally hear translated as a holy place, also means sacred river worshipped by sages. It also means guru. That's one of the meanings of the word Tirtha. So Punya Tirtha Nishevana here means one takes shelter of a pure guru. So that would be, I guess, the 4th stage here. And then from that, taking shelter of a pure guru, shushusho, one becomes eager, Vasudeva Kataruchi, one becomes eager to engage in Harikatha. So Sri Vishwanath says there are 4 stages indicated in this particular verse. I hope you're following the sequence here. We're going to move on to the next verse. Next, the Goswami says this famous verse, Shrinvatam Swakata Krishna Punya Shravana Kirtana, Hridyanta Sto Hyabhadrani Vidunoti Suhritsatam. So here in the previous verse, it says Shushusho Vasudeva Kataruchi. So there's eagerness for hearing Harikatha or Vasudeva Katha. Here there's actual hearing. Shrimvata Swakata Krishna. You're hearing Krishna Swakata, the topics spoken by Krishna or the topics about Krishna. Shrimvatam, you're actually hearing. The previous verse said their eagerness to hear. And then here you're actually doing the hearing part. Punya Shravana Kirtana. This Shravan Kirtan is itself pious activities, punya, virtuous or pious activities. So Sri Vishwanath comments about this in the Madhurya Kadambini, that this line is referring to Anishita Bhajan Kriya, right? Now you've taken shelter of a pure guru, you have eagerness to hear, then you actually start hearing, you start the practices of Shravana and Kirtana. So this line, he says, refers to Anishita Bhajan Kriya, right? Which we've already heard about, of 6 types. You begin your Bhajan Kriya, which is not steady due to anarthas. But by that Anishita Bhajan Kriya, what happens? Hridyantasto hiya bhajrani vidunoti satam. So the Supreme Lord, who is the Surhit, he is a friend of the Satam, the devotees. Then he enters inside the heart, Hridyantasto, or he is there situated within the heart. And Abhadrani Vidunoti, he cleanses the heart of the Abhadras. So this word Abhadra, which means inauspiciousness, refers to anarthas. So the cleansing of anarthas is known as anartha nivritti, right? So here, this first half of this verse is indicating Anishita Bhajan Kriya. And the second half of the verse is indicating the cleansing of the anarthas. Abhadras, there's so many inauspicious things in the heart, so that is the anarthas. So the Supreme Lord, in reciprocation with the Anishita Bhajan Kriya that is done with ardent avidity, removes the inauspicious things in the heart. So that's anartha nivritti. Okay, next verse. Nashtra prayesh abhadreshu nityam bhagavata sevaya bhagavatutama shloke bhakti bhavati nashtiki. So nashtra prayeshu abhadreshu, when almost all the abhadras are removed. Nashtra prayeshu. So nashtra means destruction. Prayeshu means almost to nil. We heard Sri Vishwanath and his Tritiya Amrita Vrishi speak about degrees of nullification. You may remember the terms Ekadasha Vartini, Bahu Desha Vartini, Prayiki, Adyantiki, Purna. These words were used there. Degrees of nullification. So it's indicated by this very verse that there are, in fact, degrees of nullification, because the previous verse mentioned Krishna removes the anarthas, and here it says when the anarthas are almost completely destroyed. So not quite completely destroyed, but almost completely destroyed. So this is indicative that there is, in fact, degrees of nullification. If you recall in our discussion on the Tritiya Amrita Vrishti, there was this need for reconciliation between certain statements of the Shastra, which speaks of like an instantaneous removal of all, ignorance and sin and so on, and this idea of a gradation. So Sri Vishwanath saying here, it's very much indicated almost to nil, so not completely to nil. And of course, Nashtra Prayeshu Abhadreshu, the abhadras that are hard to get rid of, as we discussed, were the aparads. So the effects of nam aparad can exist even up to the stage of arati. They become completely annihilated at the stage of prema. Purna was the word used, but they become absolutely annihilated only when one attains the Vastu City, or the association of the Supreme Lord. So Nashtra Prayeshu Abhadreshu means when the anarthas are almost completely destroyed, which means indicating the effects of aparat are long-standing. Okay, so how are these anarthas almost completely destroyed? Nityam Bhagavata Sevaya. When you do Nityam, constant Bhagavat Sevaya, service to the Bhagavata. Nitya means, incessant or constant, or in the context of a sadhaka, it means daily. At least daily it should go on. So what is going on? Bhagavat Sevaya. So Bhagavat Sevaya means 2 types of Bhagavatas are there. There's the person Bhagavata, and there's the book Bhagavata. So one should render seva to both. Incidentally, not incidentally, one can render sevas to both by hearing. You hear from sadhus, and what you hear was Srimad Bhagavatam. And that way, Shravanam itself is seva to the sadhus and seva to the Bhagavata. Of course, when it comes to sadhu or guru, there are so many other sevas that can also be rendered. And when it comes to the Bhagavatam, one's own personal reading of it with concentration and desire and understanding of necessity to receive its message. That is also service, but just by hearing from the sadhu, Srimad Bhagavatam, service is being rendered. So by that service, done nityam, at least daily, if not incessantly, then the abhadras, when they are almost completely destroyed to nil, then what happens? Bhagavatuttamashoke bhakti bhavati naishtiki. Then one develops naishtiki bhakti for the Supreme Lord who is glorified in choice poetry. So as far as the sequence is concerned, we heard about Anishita Bhajan Kriya and then the removal of anarthas in degrees of nullification. And then we hear about Naishtiki Bhakti. So Sri Vishwanath makes reference to this, particularly this verse and the previous verse, to show why he gave the exposition in the way that he did. It's following the sequence as presented in Srimad Bhagavatam. And of course, it's following the sequence as presented by Srila Rupa Goswami, to whom he has also offered his homage in the very beginning of the work. Srila Rupa Goswami has presented the sequence as Adhao Shraddha Tata Sadhu Sangha Tata Bhajana Kriya. Tata Anarcha Nivritti Syat Nishta. So Sri Rupa Goswami is also given the sequence. In the beginning, there's association, then faith, then Guru Padashraya, and then Bhajan Kriya. That Bhajan Kriya in Rupa Goswami's sequence means Anishita Bhajan Kriya. And then Anarcha Nivritti, after which there's Nishta. So Sri Vishwanath is basically saying that his exposition is in chastity to the presentation of Srimad Bhagavatam and Srila Rupa Goswami, of whom he himself is a follower. So we're going to do a couple other verses in the sequence just because they're very important, and Sri Vishwanath does actually speak on them in his presentation. So you take note of it here now, because when we read it from the slides, it will be very quick. In 3 slides, the whole topic of Nishta is covered. So the discussion continues here. Tada. Tada means at that time. At what time? At the time of attaining Nishtita or Naishtiki Bhakti, at that time. Tada rajastamo bhava kamalobha dayaschaye. Cheta atayar anavidham. So at that time, Rajaguna and Tamaguna, Raja Tamas Bhava. Bhava means things that come into being from Raja, Gun, and Tamagun. Are there any examples? Yes. Kama, Loba, Adhayaschaye. Kam means lust, Loba means greed, etc. So these things are produced from the Rajagun and Tamagun. So Cheta etayar anavidham. One's heart is no longer, Cheta means, the heart, basically, the mind, subtle body, is no longer pierced by these. Cheta etayar anavidham. So this word, anavidham, which is translated here, it means without being affected. The word anavidham means not pierced by the arrow. Avidam, I guess, means the arrow. And anavidam, so not pierced by the arrow. The idea is if the heart is pierced by the arrows of lust and greed and so on, then how can you relish, for example, bhakti? Just like if you get shot in the leg and I offer you some cheesecake, so you'll not be able to relish the cheesecake because their pain is there in your leg, and your whole mind will be preoccupied with that pain in the leg. So you would not be able to relish the cheesecake. First, the arrow should be removed. You should be stitched up nicely. Maybe you take some, I don't know, some aspirin or not acid, I don't know, some pharmaceutical medication, although we don't recommend that. You take some pharmaceutical or some sort of medicine to relieve the pain. Then when I offer you the cheesecake, you can relish it, right? So tada, at the time of obtaining Naishtiki Bhakti, one's heart is no longer pierced by Rajagun, Tamagun, and its effects such as Kama and Loba. Sri Vishwanath will say, this does not mean that the effects of Raja, Guna, and Tamagun do not manifest in the mind, but it's no longer pierced. In other words, he's no longer preoccupied with these things. It no longer obstructs his bhajan. Before this stage of Nishta, Bhakti, When the lust comes up and etc., then you can't do bhajan practically. You try, but you can't. Your mind keeps going to the object of desires, and that's why Rupa Goswami is saying this bhukti mukti sprihayava pishachi hridi vartate. Verse. What is that? Yeah. Bhakti tava bhakti sukhasatra katama buddhayo bhavet. So if your heart is pierced with the bhukti and mukti, you can't relish bhakti. It's not possible. So your bhajan is disrupted because of it, which means you just don't do bhajan, or even if you do bhajan, as we'll see, your mind is not into the bhajan at all. It's into other things. But at the time of attaining Nishti Bhakti, even though these things do come up in the mind of such a bhakta, it does not obstruct his bhajan. That is the meaning here. Chaita atara navidam. So Sri Vishwanath, in his commentary to this verse, mentions this actually indicates ruchi, because now that your heart is not pierced by these things, you can relish a cheesecake. Cheesecake, in my little analogy, represents bhakti. You can relish a cheesecake because now you're not pierced with an arrow in your leg. So this indicates ruchi, after which stitam sattve prasiddhati. One becomes fixed. The one stitam means fixed, sattve prasiddhati. And the sattva. So the word sattva means, of course, it means goodness, but the word can refer to material goodness, and it can refer to Shuddha Sattva, also pure goodness. So Sri Vishwanath comments, of course, that the word Sattva here refers to pure goodness, and specifically it refers to the attachment to the deity, as we'll see in a couple of showers when he's talking about asakti. The prominent feature of asakti is attachment to the transcendental form of the Lord, the deity or the form of the Lord. And prasiddhati, he's fully satisfied by that. So this is asakti bhakti. So this verse will also get mentioned today, so it was worth noting. And we'll just do the last verses just to complete the sequence of these important verses. So evam, thus, so after all of this, evam prasanna manaso bhagava bhakti yogata bhagava tattva vijnana mukta sangasa jayate. So after this, the mind becomes completely joyful, prasanna manaso. The mind becomes completely joyful. Here is an indication of the sadhya known as bhav bhakti. The mind cannot become completely joyful unless it's completely detached from all, matter things. So that happens in a complete way at the stage of rati or bhav bhakti. After which Bhagavad Bhakti Yogataha is an indication of prema bhakti. One developed Bhagavad Bhakti. Bhagavad Tattva Vijnanam. So this Bhagavad Tattva Vijnanam is within prema. There's realizations of the form of the Lord, for example, and his pastimes. Within your meditations, you can actually have darshan of them in samadhi, as indicated here by Bhagavad Tattva Vijnana. Mukta Sangasa Jayate, and this is an indication of a secondary effect. One becomes detached or liberated from matter. Mukta Sangasa, free from all sangha. So the word sangha means attachment. So Mukta Sangasa Jayate, this is a secondary effect. And the last verse in the sequence, Vidite Hridaya Grantis Chandante Sarvashamshaya. So when all doubts, sarva samshaya, are cut, chindyante, all hearts are cut, and hridaya grantis, the knot in the heart, is also been cut. Hridaya grantis is usually a reference to ignorance or false ego, which is the hard knot tying consciousness to matter. So when that is completely destroyed by bhakti, this is again a secondary effect. Then Kshigyante Chasya Karmani, then what happens is the termination of the chain of fruitive activities. Kshigyante Chasya Karmani means no more karma, basically, because you're free from Maya. Drishta evatmani ishvare, atmani ishvare, because you are seeing God. Drishta eva atmani ishvare. So this word atmani means God, who is the indwelling soul of everyone. or the word Atmani can also refer to the mind of the person who is always dwelling on God. So drishta, he is seeing that in his mind, or he's seeing directly. So Sri Vishnu indicates that this is indicating that when you're at the stage of sadhya, one sees God within as spurti, like a vision of God inside, and one can see God outside also face to face. And so because you're seeing God, there's no question of karma and all these things. That is all destroyed. So this wraps up the progression of how bhakti develops in the Srimad Bhagavatam and the way that Sri Vishwanath Chakravarti Thakur is unfolding his exposition in Madhurya Kadambini is following this sequence. So these verses are important to know and note. And now let us go to the chapter. So I'll just read. It should be able to flow very quickly at this point, having explained the meaning of these verses. Although the explanation was brief, I hope that it was clear enough. So let's look at what Sri Vishwanath has to say on Naishtiki Bhakti. Okay, first thing he writes here, as I mentioned, he wants to clarify the sequence. So he writes here, previously, two kinds of bhajan kriya were mentioned, anishtita and nishtita. Anishtita bhajan kriya was described in 6 divisions. Without describing the characteristics of nishtita bhajan kriya, cessation of anarthas was described. Right. This is because Srimad Bhagavatam says, hearing and chanting of the glories of Krishna give all auspiciousness. Sri Krishna is affectionate to the sadhus, and by entering into the heart of those who hear his glories, he destroys all kinds of inauspiciousness. Right. Then, by constantly serving Srimad Bhagavatam and the devotees, inauspiciousness is almost destroyed, and one attains steadiness and devotion to the Supreme Lord, Uttam Shloka. Right. So we covered those verses. The first line of the first verse describes Anishita Bhajan Kriya. So Shrimvata Swakata Krishna Punya Shravan and Kirtana. That describes Anishita Bhajan Kriya. After that, Nishita Bhajan Kriya is described. In 2 shlokas, destruction of inauspiciousness refers to the destruction of anarthas and the 2 kinds of bhajana kriya. Hridantasto hi abhadrani, nasha prayeshu abhadreshu. So this abhadras, inauspiciousness, refers to the anarthas, which we already covered. So inauspiciousness is almost destroyed, nasha prayeshu, almost destroyed. Means that some portion of anarthas is still left, usually the ones that are left by the non-aparats. Try to avoid those. According to the sequence of these verses, therefore, Nishita Bhakti is now being described. I think it should be clear. So we're going to go to the next little slide here. So Nishta means that manifestation of undistracted bhakti. The word that Srila Vishwanath uses here is Naishtalyam Utpana. There is manifestation of Naishtalyam. So I took just a quick, not even a sentence, phrase from Sri Jiva Goswami's commentary to the Adal Shraddha verse from the BRS, where he's also describing Nishta in a similar way. That's what I have in parentheses. Nishta tatra vikshepana satatyam, constant devotion without any distraction is known as Nishta. Okay, I should be clear. What is the meaning of Nishta? Due to the presence of grave obstacles such as laya, vikshepa, apratipati, kashaya, and rasa swada, which are very difficult to overcome, one cannot attain steadiness and devotion even after daily efforts. After anartha-nivritti, these obstacles are almost destroyed and steadiness appears in bhakti. Thus, the lack of these obstacles is the symptom of nishta. So again, due to the anarthas, all sorts of obstacles are created within and also an application of your bhajan. So 5 obstacles here are indicated that arise from having the anarthas, obstacles to performance of bhajan. We largely hear about the obstacles that we experience within ourselves, lust, etc. But those obstacles also lead to obstacles in the actual application of Krishna consciousness, where we just don't do it. We do the bare minimum, and that too half-heartedly. So this is also due to anarthas. And Obviously, because the bhajan kriya is what's going to get you over the threshold of anarthas, but the anarthas are also creating obstacles to your ardent application of bhajan. So, that's a bit of a dilemma there. So these 5 obstacles that come up are here, 5 obstacles to the, deep practice of bhakti are mentioned here. And he said, when anarthas are coming to the destruction point, then there will be absence of these obstacles to your bhakti practice. And because there's absence, therefore there could be this nishta, right? This constant devotion without distraction, because these obstacles have been overcome. So what are these obstacles? He says here, laya means the increasing tendency to sleep during chanting, hearing, and remembering. So I think chanting here refers specifically to kirtan. I should have looked at the Sanskrit. Chanting here means kirtan. So you're not sleeping so much. Hearing means tendency to sleep increases exponentially. And remembering, I think remembering here, remembering means nam smarna, like japa. Of course, for those who are advanced sadhakas and Raganuga path, they may be doing also meditation on leelas or whatever. Anyway, I don't really think that applies here. So remembering here means japa. So the tendency to sleep even greater. So how can you do bhajan if you're sleeping? Okay, vikshepa means the touch of material talks while chanting, hearing, and remembering. Means the japa bag is in your hand. You're trying to chant your 16 rounds, but something funny comes up in your head and you go and start talking. Another person starts talking, you have a little mini conversation, and in between, while they're talking, and then when they stop talking, I also thought that was funny because, so it's called vikshepa. Or in the beginning of class, before class begins, there's some prajapas going on. Then you hear the class, and right after class is over, again, you take up some prajapa. So this is called vikshepa. The touch of material talks or distraction even in the mind, talks in the mind, while chanting, hearing, and remembering, while the bhajan is supposed to be going on. Okay, aprati means the inability to do devotional parts even in the absence of laya and vikshepa. So sometimes, you're not in the mood to gossip or talk nonsense, and you're not feeling tired. So now is the time you can do focused bhakti, but you're just apathetic. No, I don't want to do it. This is called apratipati. Even there's no sleeping, even you're not so much distracted by your inner dialogue or by outer conversation. Still, you just become like indifferent. This is called pratipatti, apathy. And this one is very dangerous, obviously. Kashaya means the appearance of all habits like anger, greed, and pride during chanting, hearing, and remembering. So you're doing bhajan, and some imprint comes up from some past event that made you angry, and you kind of get absorbed in that samskara instead of your bhajan. So this is called kashaya. And of course, he says anger, greed, pride. And you start remembering something that you did that you're very proud of. You got glorification for that also. And you get absorbed in that instead of thinking of Krishna while doing bhajan. So this is called as kashaya. And rasa swada means the non-absorption of one's mind in chanting, hearing, and so on due to attainment of sensual pleasure. So you're doing your 16 rounds, but Prabhuji is cooking some cookies and the atmosphere is being permeating with the smell of these chocolate chip cookies. And your mind starts like, yeah, we finna enjoy. And you get absorbed in that when in other words, when the opportunity for enjoyment comes up, you can't focus on your bhajan. So this is called rasa swada. So because of these 5 obstacles, one does not do potent bhajan kriya. As a result, you cannot cross over the threshold. But he's saying here the opposite. You're making progress in crossing the threshold of anarthas when these 5 obstacles are not to be seen in your application of the bhajan. So he writes here, at the appearance of steadiness and devotion, the heart is not influenced by rajaguna and tamaguna, lust and greed, etc. So then he quotes a verse. The heart becomes happy and is established in Vishuddha Sattva, pure goodness. And this verse, Cha refers to the existence of Rajaguna and Tamaguna, though they exist up to the bhava stage. They do not create obstacles in the path of devotion, but exist in an ineffective state. So we already discussed this in the verse Tada Rajas. Tamo bhava kama lobha dayaschaye chetat ataira navidam. So his cheta is no longer pierced by the arrows of the effects of Rajagun, Tamagun, like lust, greed, etc. So they're still there, but he's no longer pierced by it, which means they do not create obstacles to his bhajan. So that we've already described. Okay, so the final thing he wants to say here about Nishta Bhakti, very short explanation. So 2 types of Nishtita Bhakti. So Nishta Bhakti is of 2 types. Sakshat Bhakti Vartini, directly related to devotion. So that means Shravan, Kirtan, Smarana, Padasevana, etc. And Taranukula Vastu Vartini, related to the elements that are favorable to bhakti, such as the good qualities, compassion, friendliness, tolerance. Good example, Trinadapi Sunichena, Torori Vasehishuna, Amane Namaradena, Kirtanaya Sadahari. So in this verse, Kirtanaya Sadahari is Sakshat Bhakti Vartini. Right? It is directly bhakti, kirtan of Nam Rup Guna Lila of the Lord. But the Trinada Pisunichena Torodi Vasihishuna Amanina Amanidena, that is Ta Anukula Vastu Vartini. These are qualities that are favorable to bhajan, right? Because, yeah, one who is not humble, that's not going to help your bhajan. One who is not tolerant of the various things that they encounter in the environment, then those things will distract him from bhajan. He'll be fighting with the environment all the time, and of course, the people in the environment. Giving respect to others protects your bhajan from committing the offenses. Not expecting respect protects your bhajan from committing offenses. So in this way, these qualities are very favorable to bhajan, but they have these 2 categories, that which is directly bhakti and that which is favorable to your bhakti practice. Okay. So though Sakshat Bhakti has unlimited forms, basically it has 3 divisions: Kayiki, bodily; Vachiki, vocal; and Manasi, mental. So that means you're doing the angas of bhakti with your body, mind, and words. Right? Body means like offering obeisances, massaging the devotees, massaging the deity, gardening for the Lord's worship, and etc. This is things that you do with your body. Vachiki means speaking Harikatha, doing kirtan, reciting stutis and bhajans and prayers and so on. This is what you do with the voice, of course. And manasi means meditating on the Supreme Lord, contemplating the meanings of Shastra, etc. So whatever forms of bhakti, they'll be used with the body, mind, words, basically. Okay. So in the view of some, the sequence for appearance of steadiness is bodily, vocal, and mental. So one becomes steady first in the bodily services, then later with their vocal services, and then the mental, which kind of makes sense. Some say there is no such sequence for the appearance of steadiness. So because different souls, we have different samskars. So all the commentators, they point this out. We all have different samskars. So basically what we call as our nature, long discussion on this like a month back. But basically what we call our nature is the conglomerate of fructified samskaras for this particular life. And so according to some, depending on the types of samskaras, some have strong bodies, some have strong gregarious nature. They like to talk a lot. That's me. Like, I like to call it the gift of gab because that makes it sound more positive, but it's definitely something that I picked up from my dad incidentally, meeting him January in 2020. I figured this out. And some people with some scars, they just have like a more reserved nature, and they have the tendency for a more contemplative way of being just by some scars, not because they're spiritual necessarily. It's just their nature. So according to that, then you may develop steadiness in a different order. That's all it's saying here. So if you have a more contemplative sort of nature, then you may develop steadiness in that area first, and then later in body and so on. So there is no such sequence. Anyway, so different opinions about how Nishita Bhakti develops in a person. It doesn't seem to me that Sri Vishwanath's saying one way or the other, but he's just pointing out different Vaishnavas speak of it in these ways. Okay, so due to difference in tolerance, strength, and vitality in the devotees, according to the different samskaras, right, they are more or less favorable to the Lord. Thus, others say that there is no gradation in them. Okay, so we covered that. All right, so that's his point about Sakshat Bhakti Vartini, and now his other point about Ta Anukula Vastu Vartini. Humility, respectfulness, friendliness, and compassion are elements favorable to bhakti. These favorable elements are often seen even in self-controlled devotees who have not even yet attained nishita in devotion. So, yeah, like I said, some people by nature are a little bit more reserved, contemplative, self-control. So they'll exhibit a lot of the good qualities of the Sattva even. But they're not fixed in their Shravan, Kirtan, Smarna, etc. Okay. On the other hand, such qualities may not be observed in arrogant devotees who have attained nishita in devotion. So that means this devotee is very fixed in his Shravan, Kirtan, Smarna, but he's got some bad qualities that are clearly exhibited or clearly observable by others. Oh, he's proud, like it stands out, but he's fixed in his Shravan, Kirtan, Smarna. So he has nishita bhakti. So this is a bit of a confusion. So he talks about it here and then concludes. I always like this little section because it's just like a well, you'll see why. So he says here, the presence of nishita based on these qualities and the absence of nishita due to the lack of these qualities appears true not only to ignorant persons, but intelligent persons as well. Very important sentence. So in other words, people who are in full ignorance of the tattva, they will say that if you're really a worshiper of God, you should have all these qualities. So they're in ignorance, and it's totally understandable why a person might think that. But he's saying here that even persons who have knowledge, they also think like this. So you'll hear that in our devotional communities all the time. Like if you were fixed in bhakti, then you would have these qualities. And despite showing fixity in Shravan, Kirtan, Smarna, because you are exhibiting clearly observable bad qualities, you're clearly not fixed in bhakti, and the tendency will be not to respect, or at least in your heart, not to have so much regard for such a devotee who doesn't exhibit the good qualities, even if he seems to be fixed. And his sadhana, like he goes to Mangal Arti, he chants japa without sleeping and distraction, he does hearing without sleeping, distraction. So yeah, that makes sense. Like it actually makes sense. And this is not thought just by ignorant people, also learned people think in this way. Sri Vishwanath wants to make a comment about this though. So he says, the Bhagavata says, on the appearance of steadiness and devotion, the heart remains unaffected by Rajagun, Tamagun, and lust and greed, etc. Then the heart experiences divine bliss and is established in the Vishuddha Sattva platform. So the reason he's quoting this verse is because the explanation of this verse, as we covered it, was to say that although the effects of Rajagun and Tamagun will be present in such a devotee, they do not affect him. Anavidham. Anavidham means they do not create obstacles to his bhajan, right? That was how we discussed it. That's how Sri Vishwanath Chakravarti Thakur was unfolding the subject matter. So the effects of Rajagun, Tamagun, so like some pride may be there, some other bad qualities that are related to the lower gunas of nature, they may still be present in the nature of such a devotee, but they don't create obstacles to his bhajan. That was the point that was made by that particular verse of Srimad Bhagavatam. So here, quoting that verse, he goes on to finish here. Slackness or intensity in chanting and hearing are the best criteria for determining a nishita and nishita bhakti. So it seems that Sri Vishwanath's opinion is that, if someone has nishita and sakshat bhakti, direct devotional angas, then that is the real indicator of nishta and not just the qualities favorable to bhakti, which can be seen in devotees who are self-controlled by their karmic inheritance, but who don't have that fixity in bhakti. So yeah, this just reminds one of the statement again, a verse that I'm often referencing. Drishtai swabhava janitar vapushascha doshar. Now pakrita tvamiha bhakta janasha pasha, that one should not look at the devotee's swabhava and his vapu, his body, with eyes filled with pakriti, from the material point of view. Now pakrita tvam iha bhakta janasha pasha. So you look for the material eyes and you'll make this as, oh, he has so many bad qualities, therefore. And then whatever comes after that, therefore, is usually very dangerous. Therefore, I will not regard this person so highly in my heart or whatever. And there may be even tendency to disrespect such a person, because usually that's how it works. Someone disrespects you, you just disrespect them back, or you feel disrespected and you just kind of reciprocate that energy. So here, Sri Vishwanath's opinion is that if a person is showing that, that ardent avidity and dogged determination in his performance of the angas of bhakti, then it is understood that he's attained nishta, or one might infer that such a devotee has attained nishta. Of course, on the strength of these statements, if someone's just thinking I can be like a jackass and I also have nishita bhakti, and God knows what's going on internally. But it's just speaking to this idea that to be fixed means to really be fixed in bhakti, and not necessarily that one is fixed or manifesting even all the good qualities that are expected to be manifest and the devotee who has good qualities. I was on, as you guys know, I was on the Wisdom of the Sages show yesterday, and I brought this up also, or maybe I brought it up the first time, that maybe the first episode I did 2 days ago. When people glorify sadhus, they tend to glorify the secondary qualities, which are a lot more appreciable for the empirical mind, like friendliness and humility and respectfulness. Like, that's really appreciable. You don't hear, like, a lot of the time. I mean, it's just kind of interesting. You don't hear a lot of the time, even like at a Vyasa Puja, disciples even glorifying like how you're fixed in your devotion. It's like, I guess because that's just a given, so no need to glorify that. But it could be telling. I'm not saying that it necessarily is the case, but the absence of appreciation of that central quality, the quality that's considered the Swarup Lakshana, an absence of appreciation for that may be indicative of a lack of understanding, or Sri Vishwanath's saying here that even people who are learning things like this also, so not even necessarily a lack of understanding, but it's just interesting how the central quality that someone's just like absorbed in their bhajan, even though they have bad qualities. For those of you who were on the show 2 days ago, I had mentioned the story of Radhe Shyam Vilas. And as I mentioned that story, he was not the easiest devotee to get along with. Devotees were constantly beefing with him in the ashram, because I stayed in a Harinam ashram when I was in Braj for a couple of consecutive years. And I stayed in the what they call the Russian room. A lot of people didn't like to stay in the Russian room because everyone in the Russian room was unsurprisingly very strict about like schedules and different things like that. So no one wanted to stay there. So they put me in the Russian room, and right across from me and the opposite bunk was Radhe Shyam Vilas. And he and I ended up becoming like kind of like friends. Like, he appreciated me, I appreciated him. I made sure to never get on his bad side, but he was not the easiest devotee to get along with. He would chastise devotees quite heavily. Even when we were doing kirtan in the temple room, night shift, he could like blast off and like probably be ready to like fist fight you. Like, he would bring that sort of energy. So he wasn't the easiest person to get along with. I'm saying this as an example of a person who didn't necessarily seem to manifest all the good qualities, but he definitely had a dogged determination in his seva. He had a dogged determination to stay in Braja, as I mentioned in the story. He would prefer to live in a prison in Vrindavan than to be sent out of Vrindavan. So he's just not telling where he's from, and they can't deport him because they don't know where to deport him to. That shows like just an amazing dogged determination. And of course, as I mentioned in the story, he was able to inspire a whole Krishna Janmashtami festival in the prison. And now devotees are like really starting to appreciate, like, wow, this is an amazing person. He's talking, they're visiting him every now and again. He's talking about how he's happy. He's just chanting 64 rounds. And during Hari Katha, this is the happiest he's ever been. And now it's what's shining through is like, oh, like the main quality of a devotee, which is that dogged determination to do bhajan and to be absorbed in Krishna. And the lack of secondary qualities exhibited by him and our experience with him in the ashram has become inconsequential in the minds of those who are now appreciating him. Anyway, so I'm just bringing that up as an example to give some context for this sort of discussion, Sri Vishwanath. He ends the shower there. That's the end of it. Thus concludes the brief description of steadiness and devotion. So I hope the subject matter was clear enough. We can look at some questions here. Hari Om Tat Sat. Okie doke. Says here, interestingly, the verse from chapter 2 talks about service done to those who are free from all vices. That word doesn't actually come up in the Sanskrit of the verse. I know Prabhupada's put it there. And I think it's related to an earlier thing that was said in chapter 1, where the great souls are free from all vices. But in the actual verse itself, I'm just pulling it back up for my own reference. Yeah. Well, you can use the word punya tirtha nishevana, but even that is referring to the guru here. So Syam Mahat Sevaya Vipra. Yeah, it just says Mahat Sevaya. So not that this addition, free from all vices, is misleading, because it is expected that a Mahat, a great soul, has all the good qualities, but that isn't specifically told in the verse. Just throwing that out there. Okay, I'll read the rest of your thing. It's not service to anyone. And then for you, you're taking that as any other devotees. Well, I don't know. That's, are those devotees who have received grace not great souls also, by dint of receiving something great from the great souls? I'm just throwing that out there as a point of discussion or consideration. If someone has received the grace of a great soul, does that not make them great to some degree? Because there are a lot of jivas out here who don't receive that, even when they have opportunity to. But out of the millions and millions of jivas, one of them has received it. Does that not make them great to some degree? Or they've received something great. They received the affection of a great soul. Does that not make them somewhat special and worthy of appreciation and service? I'm just throwing that out there as a question of consideration in our own thinking about it. As Sri Narayan says to Durvas Muni, Aham Bhakta Pradhanina, Aham Bhakta Pradhina. He aswatantra ivaduja, sadhu begrastar hidaya, bhaktair bhakta janapriya. Even those who are dear to my bhaktas are dear to me. Because that bhakta has invested in that person. I shared this, I forget where, recently, so it's in my mind fresh. There was this young man from UK. He got on Hridaya Namarsh's case and like a Facebook post. This was like years ago. It must have been like 2015 or something. It was like a while ago. And I remember him writing something really heavy about Hridaya Namarsh on his Facebook post. So I just sent him a quick message. I was like, hey, bro, this, whatever, whether your point is right or wrong, I'm just letting you know that he might be like super dear to Srila Prabhupada for all that he's done for his movement. You might want to be careful with that. You might want to be careful with finding that fault in public like that. Just throwing it out there. And he kind of responds to me. He was like, oh, like, yeah, I didn't think about that. And then this is reminding me of Hayagriva. Even during Prabhupada's time, he left and was doing whatever, his sense gratification or whatever it was he was doing. But whenever Prabhupada would visit an area and it came to his attention that Hayagriva was in the area, he would ask for him. And he spoke of Hayagriva as he spoke of himself as having an eternal relationship with Hayagriva. Like that much affection Srila Prabhupada had for Hayagriva Prabhu. Or there was Sridham Swami, Subal Sridham Swami. He was a black Swami. He left Krishna consciousness and got, started walling out in the material energy. And I think he got cancer or something. And then he came back to the movement a short time before leaving the body. And as he was on his deathbed, surrounded by devotees, apparently Prabhupada came to him. He said, Prabhupada, it's true, you came. Prabhupada, you came. And then he left his body. So like this, I'm just throwing it out there as a point of reflection that it says service to anyone, not any other devotee. You put that in parentheses. I'm just saying, I don't know. That's all I want to say on that. Of course, service is rendered with discernment, as we hear from Upadeshamrita, Krishneti Yasha Girita Manasadriyeta, etc. So it's rendered with discernment. Some devotees are served in the mind, maybe from a distance. Other devotees who have received Diksha, Diksheticha Pranatabish Chabajantam Isham, we're told to offer the pranams. They receive Diksha. And, it is assumed that they've understood the philosophy and they're surrendering their lives. So pranams. And then other devotees who are bhajana vigya, nindadi shunya hrida ipsita sangha labdya. They are bhajana vigna. They're advanced in bhajan. And as exhibited by their heart being completely free from the tendency to do ninda, blasphemy, etc., and the other aggressive energies that comes with ninda, then those devotees are to be surrendered to. So it is true that we are to render service with discernment, but we just want to make sure that our thinking isn't go, oh, you got vices, therefore you're not worthy of service, which very quickly translates in our mind as you're worthy of my contempt. At least for a lot of conditioned souls, it quickly translates into that, at least in my personal vicarious observation of it. Okay, you go on to say, this indicates that the purity of the object of our service is important for us to get the actual benefit. Well, the purity of the object is certainly important for us, but you get the actual benefit. If you're just thinking about it, the benefit you get subjectively, you get benefit from rendering service to all sorts of, even if you think some devotee who has vice and you render some simple service like giving some prasad, treating them with kindness, provided they're not like out in the atmosphere blaspheming everyone and so on, then you're in a sense rendering service to that sadhu who is invested in that particular devotee. Because there's a chain of, he's connected to something that's substantial and beautiful. So rendering service to him is in some sense rendering service to he who is invested in him. So I'm just throwing this out here. Your points are not incorrect necessarily, but they can be a little short-sighted. So I'm trying to stretch the vision a little bit so we kind of steer clear of the tendency to commit aparat, which usually manifests in how we think about these things first. Okay. How is it that purity of the served, now here's a question part. How is that the purity of the served is important than the servant who is serving selflessly and purely? Can you please share more? I think I've covered this in the way that I'm speaking about the subject matter. How is it that the purity of the served is important? Yeah, that is important. But it's more important than the servant who is serving selflessly and purely. So both are important. And that's how I'm trying to nuance the discussion. So just here, an example of this from Gaur Lila, there was one, what was his name? It begins with a D. Devananda Pandit? No, maybe it was Devananda Pandit. I'm kind of forgetting. Anyway, before he was kind of got the mercy of Vaikeshwar Pandit, whom I think he would later take initiation. He was like some devotee who was glorified for his Srimad Bhagavatam recitation, but he wasn't even a devotee, or if he was like super arrogant, kind of intolerable. So one time, Srivas came to one of his classes, and hearing Srimad Bhagavatam, Srivas went into ecstasy, started crying in the back of the room. So Devananda Pandit, either he had Srivas removed, or the disciples feeling disturbed by Srivas and maybe think he was imitating ecstasy or whatever, removed him from the class, and Devananda didn't protest. So Mahaprabhu gave him heavy sauce for that. And I don't know, he may have gotten some reaction for that also as a result. Later on, when seeking grace, I guess becoming compelled by Mahaprabhu's movement, wanting to join, Mahaprabhu wasn't having it. And then later he got the mercy of Vaikeshwar Pandit and was able to remove the defect of his misgiving. Anyway, I tell the story from the viewpoint of Srivas. So he's hearing from Devananda Pandit, who's a Brahmana, maybe not even a devotee or one of not necessarily the highest order of purity. And yet he's being moved by the discussions of Srimad Bhagavatam, which is coming from him. So the purity of the servant rendering service also is playing a role in all of this. There's a dynamic there. It's not just a one-way street. Tamir, how is Vikshepa different from Kashaya and Rasaswada? Well, they come from similar gunas of nature, so in that sense, they are not indistinct. Vikshepa here is referring to the sort of general prajalpa that comes up, talking about this or that and the other thing. Whereas Kashaya means getting absorbed. It says specifically getting absorbed in bad habits, or the samskaras that were produced by bad habits while doing bhajan. And Rasaswada means when the opportunity for sense gratification comes up, then you can't do bhajan. So that is very different from the others. The others are, one of them is basically getting distracted by prajalpa. The other is getting distracted like by your mind. And the other is getting distracted by circumstances of enjoyment. When they pop up, you can't do bhajan. So there's subtle distinctions there. There's some subtle. One is vocal, one is mental, one is bodily in a sense. You can say Vikshepa, talking this and that is vocal. The Kashaya, more mental, some bad habit or some scar of it is coming in the mind, and that's taking up all your energy. And the Rasaswada, like bodily, some opportunity for sense enjoyment comes up and you put your beat back down and you enjoy. So some small distinction there. Kantara Nukula Vasu Vartini is explained that sometimes devotees may show strong fixity in bhajan, but show some bad qualities. And you explain that the lower modes of passion and ignorance, even when they are there, they don't affect his bhajan or fixity of his bhajan. My question is, yes, they may not affect his bhajan, but it affects other devotees. I mean, if he is offending devotees because of his bad qualities like arrogance or pride, how can his bhajan remain fixed? Well, if he's offending devotees, it won't remain fixed. Right? So he'll experience the effects of aparad. As we mentioned, the 5 effects are there. We talked about kotilya, crookedness, faithlessness, absorption, other objects that erode steadiness to Bhagavan. Slackness of bhakti was one of them. And the 5th one was the 5th bhakti shaitolya. And the 5th one was, I forget what the 5th one was. 5 effects of the aparad we talked about. So if he's committing aparad, that will not happen. This will be the effect of that aparad. But what if that isn't happening? But still you are seeing the bad qualities. Another thing I'm realizing, this is just somewhat of a sidebar. So in our community, this whole topic of is bhakti inherent, is it not inherent, is like somehow exploded into the psyche of the greater community. Again, it's been agitated. It was there in the 90s. Now again, it's somehow been agitated. And I'm just hearing devotees from both sides talking about the other side and their perceptions of it. And Mukunda also is knowing, because we're on a little thread together where we talk about this a little bit. And it's just kind of interesting and hilarious, honestly, how devotees are looking at other devotees who disagree with them and how they feel offended by that. How a devotee is choosing to, let's say, reconcile his faith to Prabhupada and, certain contradictory things that Prabhupada has said in his teachings. one devotee does it in one way and the other devotee does it another way. But one devotee is feeling offended by how the other devotee is reconciling the faith and saying that this is having profound implication on the greater community. It will destroy faith and like really heavy statements. Or recently, I was just this morning listening to Namras's podcast with Tripurari Swami, a very beautiful episode about being an author in Gaudiya Vaishnavism. I mean, Tripurari Swami is very gifted in articulation of Krishna consciousness. So it was a very beautiful episode. Anyway, I was listening to it, but before I heard the episode, someone had mentioned a prominent personality, one whom I personally respect very much, had mentioned that he heard that Tripurari Maharaj had attacked Sundara Gopal, who had also appeared on Namras's show to contend with this whole bhakti inherent thing and so on. So I was like, oh, okay, let me go and hear this and see, like, wow, what is he saying? So I heard the episode. All he said in like a very dispassionate way was that he found Sundara Gopal's presence not very compelling. He was underwhelmed. He didn't find his points hold up to scrutiny, and they weren't very compelling arguments for him. But he really appreciated the matter and the sort of sensitivity in which he approached the subject matter. And I was like, that doesn't sound like an attack to me. That just sounds like he wasn't convinced by the way that he presented it, but he appreciated his mood and the method of presentation. So that doesn't sound like an attack, but someone heard it as an attack. So, like I said, bhakti is being performed under you can say the audience of bhakti are, ultimately God and the great souls. So they can see what's going on inside. So sometimes devotees are feeling offended, but I don't know if that always means that you are offended. And I think devotees, like the sort of contemporary social world, they take their feeling of offense to be that they're actually have been offended. And I don't know if it works like that. That just because I feel offended, that means I am offended, or that the person committed offense to me. And of course, Krishna knows if offense is actually going on, then one will experience the effects. And we've already covered that quite a bit when discussing Anartha Nivritti. But I don't think we just get to elevate our feelings to the position of being able to put devotees in this tight squeeze. I feel offended, therefore I am offended by you. And therefore, you're not going to be able to be fixing your bhajan. So no, if he's able to be fixing his bhajan despite his nature, which may present somewhat of an issue for the devotees around him, then according to this explanation, he's got Nishchita Bhakti. Again, I can quote Radheshyam Vilas. I tell you, like, if you have to live in the ashram with him, oh, it would be so funny. Because I was in the cubicle, right, or the bunker right across from him, and we had our beds were such that we could sit up straight in our bed if we wanted to. And we had like a little desk inside, and we put a little curtain so we can have like our little privacy while we were in there. And many times devotees would come into the room, they would be like arguing with him about this or that. And I would just be like laughing because it would be funny to me, even though they're like in the heat of an argument, it's very serious for them. I would find it quite funny in most of the cases. Sometimes it seemed like over such a small thing, things would explode. But maybe devotees felt offended by him also when he did that, but his determination didn't slacken. So there's something to be said about that. Also, just another side point on this, one thing that I'm observing in this new controversy is that devotees project their feelings about a person onto other people. So if they're offended by someone, they'll see that someone disagreeing with that same person is also offended by him. And that way he's offending so many devotees. And it's like, no, I don't think it works like that. So in any case, Krishna knows what's going on. So if there is actual transgression, there will be the effects of that. Okay, in light of the story of Radheshyam Prabhu, what should our understanding be of devotees who have amazing fixity in their bhajan while simultaneously having major, in all caps, tendency to blasphemy devotees? Nah. those two can't be in the same locus. So again, like I'm saying, we're someone feeling offended and someone actually being offended is two different things. And if someone is like major, has a major tendency for blaspheming devotees, that's sadhu ninda. So we've already covered that when discussing anartha nivritti. So
quick follow up on that. So just to,
of course, someone may say, can
you hear me, Prabhu?
When I see him, he seems to be very fixed up. Maybe, but that could be very performative, because one of the effects of sadhu ninda is kautilya, right? Crookedness. So you show yourself in one way to the society and something else going on internally. And that's very possible to do. Once you get integrated into a community and you have a certain reputation that you want to maintain, practicing crookedness is a very easy thing. Oh, I wasn't able to hear you.
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Oh, sorry. Yeah. So one thing I just wanted to kind of round out my understanding then. So because I definitely can think of one particular person that I know who has just the worst tendency to blaspheme devotees. And they also have a very, at least externally, very impressive, sadhana. But I guess then we probably, because these two things cannot exist simultaneously according to this. So then maybe then that manifestation of their sadhana is like, maybe it's just like some type of external thing that's not deeper, I guess, should be the understanding.
See, with these sorts of things, you're not living with the person, so you don't know what his sadhana actually is, right? You know what you see, and it seems to be, very fixed. So yeah, there's indication of that. But what's going on inside, or what's going on inside his house, I'm talking about, and of course inside his own mind, that we don't get to see. So we don't know what's exactly happening. But even in those cases, one of the effects of offenses, kautilya, is crookedness, right? So what I'm saying is, after you get integrated into a community, and you get a certain reputation also within the community, later on, when you're struggling internally on account of, let's say, sadhu ninda, then in order to show face, you have to keep up the performance, right? It's not coming from a natural flow of focus on Bhagavan, but rather I have to keep, the show must go on. So this is called kautilya, this is called crookedness. So this can be going on. Srila Bhakti Siddhanta, I don't remember precisely. It's a commentary on Chaitanya Bhagavat, but it's in one of the opening verses. I would have to find it. It's in Madhya Khan for sure. But he talks about a devotee, even if they look like they're rigid and doing, nam japa, he may have said something funny like they're doing 192 rounds or something, they have no bhakti. Like something very heavy if they commit aparad, because Chaitanya Bhagavat, there's a strong focus on Vaishnav Seva and avoiding the non-aparads. That's like the whole message of the Chaitanya Bhagavat. I would have to find that. So anyway, these sorts of knowledge is not meant for us to precisely like judge others, more to make an estimation of our own selves. But in the case of this, if someone's committing offenses, and it generally is like sadhu ninda, then there's no question of them having bhakti. And even if you could put on some sort of performance outside, which many of us can actually, what's happening in the heart? I'm thinking of Ramchandra Puri. He committed aparad to his guru. And later on, when he came to visit the Mahaprabhu, he was showing himself as sannyasi. And there's no discussion that he was not fixed in his sannyas dharma, for example. So externally, he was a sannyasi and he was well situated. But what was the nature of his heart? His heart was also ashmasadam hridaya batedam, right? Yeah, Harinam, wait, why am I? Tadashma Saran, Hridaya Bhatayam, Nagrihamana Harinamadheya. Now, Vikriye Tata Yatavikaro, his heart was not changed. His heart was hard. Even though externally the Harinam is going on, but there's no transformation of the heart. There's no ecstasy. We've already covered this verse a couple of times. Sri Vishnu has brought it up also. So why the heart not transforming? Because he committing aparad. So yeah, these are all these statements we have to take together. I guess what happens, there's a little bit of this in your question. What happens is that we want to see a person suffer if they're apparatis. We're like, hey, this guy's committing so much offense, but he looks steady. Like he should. That's it, right?
Yeah, for sure.
There's a little bit of that in the question. We want to see them like fall down. Maybe they get into a car accident. They live, but they got into a car accident. That was because of the apparatus. So I feel validated in my understanding. So maybe that's a defect on our side, that we want to see someone suffer the consequences of their offenses. You hear all these amazing stories in Chaitanya Charitamrita, they committed offense to Haridas Thakur and their nose fell off. I'm like, yeah. So if that isn't happening, then what's going on? Maybe aparat isn't being done. So that is for Krishna to judge. If your heart remains rock solid despite doing Hari Bhajan, then what is the point of what is the point of such a fixed sadhana? If doing Harinam for years and years and years and years, and we are unable to cry because our heart is so hard, cry for our sadhya, cry from the separation from devotees. Who is that? And the Chaitanya Charitamrita Ramananda Roy was asked by Mahaprabhu, what is the greatest suffering in this world? And Ramananda Roy responded, he said, aside from separation from the devotees, I know of no greater misery in this world. But we get separated from devotees, we don't even care. It's not even a problem for us. Devotees talking about, I think I'm going to move here. It's like I got a really nice place. I got good work. And I can make like a lot of money, which I'll donate it to the devotees, but I'll make good money. I was like, well, are there any devotees around? No, there aren't devotees around, but I think I'm in a place now where it's just like your heart is hard, bro. Not, and this is not a comment on about life choices per se, but if you don't feel any separation from the devotees, you don't even care that you're not going to be in their sangha, no love, then what's the point? So for any sadhaka who's trying to get the sadhya, the inability to cry for their sadhya, the inability to cry from separation from devotees, it's going to be disturbing to them. Why am I not able to cry? Why am I not able to feel anything? Oh, because I'm committing aparad. Then they will make adjustment. But for the devotee who is happy with performative bhakti yoga, then they may keep on the show despite having a hard heart. And externally, sadhana may be looking good, but internally, heart remaining hard. So if they're satisfied with that, they can go on like that and die. As Kaviraj Goswami says, one can Bahu Janma, what is that? I forget the verse in chapter 8 of the Adi Lila. One may go on for, thousands of lifetimes chanting Hari Nam in this way and never achieve the sadhya. So if you're about that life, go for it. I'm just going to say, Prabhu, is Nishta, Nishita, they're the same? Yes, there's the same thing. Nishta is one word, and Nishtita. Nishtita, the word ta means like ness, like goodness. So nishtaness, that's basically what it is. Nishtita means like nishtaness, having the quality of nishta. Like goodness means having the quality of good, like it's permeating your entire being. Yeah. Okay. It's 9:35. If there are any other questions, can we take them tomorrow? Just remind me at the beginning of the class that there were some questions left over and we can take them in the beginning. It's already 9:30. I need to eat lunch and then I have DD Saver today. And so it's a lot.
It's okay. But you mean Monday, right? Because tomorrow.
Oh, yeah. I mean, Monday. Just so don't forget, just remind me on Monday.
Okay, but it was going to be on this same thread.
That's okay.
Okay, okay.
It's a good thread. It's a good thread because it's a challenging one for us all.
And I'm apologizing ahead of time because you will probably feel like you already answered the question, but it's not registering.
Oh, okay, cool. I'm looking at a private message. Okay. I'll see you all Monday. Hari Om Tat Sat. Thanks a lot. Srila Prabhupada Ki Jai. Hari Bo.